Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People's Story. HOA Karen kept stealing my chicken eggs, so I swapped them with exploding rotten ones. I taught them a lesson and came out on top. It all started 3 months ago when my wife and I moved into what we thought was our dream home. A quaint 3-bedroom house with a spacious backyard in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The property was perfect, just enough land for my longtime dream of keeping backyard chickens while still being close enough to the city for my wife's commute. Before we even finished unpacking, I started planning the chicken coop. I'd researched everything meticulously. Local ordinances, proper coop designs, chicken breeds best suited for backyard egg production. I even attended a weekend workshop at the local agricultural extension office to make sure I was doing everything right. Within a month of moving in, I had built a beautiful coop that could house up to 6 hens comfortably. It was painted the same soft blue as our house trim, had proper ventilation, nesting boxes, a covered run area, and was as predator-proof as I could make it. I was proud of my handiwork, and even my wife, who had initially been skeptical about the whole chicken operation, admitted it looked nice. Once the coop was ready, I brought home 4 lovely hens, 2 buff Orpingtons and 2 Americanas. I named them all, but for the purposes of this story, they were just my girls. They settled in quickly, and within a couple of weeks, they started laying eggs. The Orpingtons produced beautiful brown eggs, while the Americanas gave us gorgeous blue-green ones. I was in backyard farmer heaven. That's when I first met the HOA president. I'll call her Karen, because that's exactly who she was. I was collecting eggs one morning when I heard someone clearing their throat rather loudly behind me. I turned around to find a middle-aged woman with that distinctive "I need to speak to the manager" haircut, designer sunglasses perched on top of her head, and an expression that suggested she'd just smelled something unpleasant. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with forced politeness, "but I don't believe chickens are allowed in our neighborhood." I smiled and reached into my pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Actually, they are. I checked the county ordinances before moving in. This property is zoned to allow up to 6 hens, no roosters. I've also made sure the coop meets all the requirements for distance from property lines and neighboring structures." I handed her the printout of the county ordinance. She glanced at it dismissively before handing it back. "Well, the HOA has additional rules. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association, by the way." She held out her hand stiffly. "And I don't recall approving any chicken coops." I shook her hand briefly. I wasn't aware we needed HOA approval. We checked our closing documents and the HOA covenants before purchasing, and there was no prohibition against chickens, as long as they comply with county regulations, which mine do. Karen's smile tightened. "Well, perhaps that was an oversight. I'll have to bring this up at the next board meeting. In the meantime, I hope those birds won't be causing any disturbances. Some residents might find them unsanitary." I assured her that chickens, when properly kept, are quite clean animals, and that my coop design prevented any odors or noise issues. She seemed unimpressed, but left without further comment. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. So very wrong. A few days later, I noticed something odd. I'd collected 4 eggs the day before, but when I went to the coop in the morning, there were only 2 eggs in the nesting boxes. I figured maybe the girls were adjusting to their new environment and their laying schedule was a bit erratic. It happens with chickens sometimes, especially when they're settling into a new home. But the next day, the same thing happened again. I knew for certain that all 4 hens had laid eggs. I had even seen them in the nesting boxes in the late afternoon. Yet, when I went to collect them the following morning, 2 were missing. This pattern continued for several days, and I started to get suspicious. "Someone's stealing our eggs," I told my wife over breakfast. She looked up from her coffee. "Are you sure? Maybe a snake got into the coop. They can swallow eggs whole, you know." I shook my head. "I've checked the coop thoroughly for any access points. It's secure. No predator is getting in there. Besides, if it were a snake or a raccoon, they'd probably take all the eggs, not just some of them." My wife suggested setting up a camera, which was exactly what I was thinking. That weekend, I installed a small wildlife camera aimed at the chicken coop. It was the kind hunters use to track deer, motion-activated and with night vision capability. I positioned it in a nearby tree where it wouldn't be easily noticed. 2 days later, I had my answer, and I was livid. The camera had captured clear images of Karen, yes, the HOA president herself, sneaking into our backyard at around 5:30 in the morning, letting herself into the chicken run, which I hadn't locked because it was inside our fenced yard, and helping herself to eggs from the nesting boxes. She was even selective, taking only the blue-green eggs from the Americanas, apparently finding them more exotic or desirable. I was furious. Not only was she trespassing on our property, but she was also stealing from us after giving me grief about having chickens in the first place. The hypocrisy was astounding. I showed the photos to my wife, who was equally outraged. "You should confront her," she suggested, "or report her to the police for trespassing and theft." I considered it, but something held me back. This was a small neighborhood, and we were the newcomers. Karen had clearly been in power for a long time, and I suspected she had a lot of influence. Making an enemy of her so soon after moving in seemed unwise. Besides, calling the police over a few eggs might seem petty, even if it was the principle of the thing. "Let me think about this," I told my wife. "There might be a better way to handle it." For the next few days, I stewed over Karen's audacity while trying to come up with the appropriate response. Then, inspiration struck while I was cleaning out the refrigerator and found an egg that had gotten pushed to the back and forgotten. It was definitely past its prime, and when I cracked it into the trash, the smell was eye-watering. That's when I hatched my plan. Pun very much intended. I did some research and learned about water glassing, an old method of preserving eggs without refrigeration. Essentially, you submerge fresh eggs in a solution of lime water, calcium hydroxide, not the fruit, which seals the porous shells and prevents air from entering. Eggs preserved this way can last for months. But if eggs start to go bad before they're preserved, the process simply locks in the rot. I gathered several eggs and left them out in the warm garage for a week, giving them plenty of time to start rotting. Then I carefully placed them in a lime water solution in a sealed container and let them sit for another few days. The next step was crucial. I needed to make these eggs recognizable as the special blue-green ones that Karen seemed to prefer. I bought some food-grade egg dye and colored the now preserved rotten eggs to match the distinctive blue-green shade of my Americanus eggs. The final touch was subtle but important. I used a very fine needle to create a tiny, nearly invisible hole in each egg. This would ensure that when the eggs were cracked open, the pressure built up by the decomposition gases would be released all at once, creating what I like to think of as a controlled explosion of rotten egg stench. With my arsenal prepared, I was ready. I carefully placed 2 of these special eggs in the nesting boxes used by my Americana hens and collected the real eggs they laid. Then I waited. The next morning, I checked the camera footage. Sure enough, Karen had made her usual early morning visit and taken the planted eggs. I felt a mixture of vindication and anticipation. Now, we wait. I didn't have to wait long. That very afternoon, there was a pounding at our front door that was so forceful it made the windows rattle. I opened it to find Karen, her face flushed with rage. "You!" she shrieked, pointing a finger at me. "You disgusting, horrible person! What kind of sick joke was that?" I feigned confusion. "I'm sorry? What are you talking about?" "The eggs!" she yelled, her voice rising to a pitch that probably only dogs could fully appreciate. Those things you left in your chicken coop." "My eggs?" I asked innocently. "What's wrong with my eggs?" Karen was so angry she was practically sputtering. They exploded! The smell! I can't get it out of my kitchen. My whole house reeks. My clothes reek. I had to throw away my favorite blouse." I furrowed my brow in mock concern. "That sounds terrible, but I'm confused. How would you know anything about my eggs unless—" I paused for effect. "Unless you've been taking them without permission." Her face went through an impressive range of expressions. Rage, embarrassment, indignation, and finally, a poor attempt at dignified outrage. "That's beside the point," she huffed. "What you did was chemical warfare." I laughed. I couldn't help it. Chemical warfare? They're just eggs, Karen. Sometimes eggs go bad. Nature's way, you know? Especially when someone leaves the coop door open and disrupts the hen's environment. They get stressed. The eggs deteriorate faster. It happens. "But they exploded," she insisted. "Eggs with high bacteria content build up gases," I explained calmly, as if I were talking to a child. "When those gases are released suddenly, like when you crack the egg, it can be quite dramatic. Basic science, really." Karen glared at me, clearly understanding that I knew exactly what she had been up to. We stood in silence for a moment, at an impasse. Finally, she straightened her posture and sniffed. "Well, I'll have you know I'll be bringing this up at the next HOA meeting. Your chicken coop is an eyesore and a health hazard. The board will be voting on an amendment to explicitly ban poultry." I smiled pleasantly. "That's your right, of course. And I'll be bringing my camera footage to that same meeting. I'm sure the board and all our neighbors would be interested to see the HOA president trespassing on private property and stealing. I wonder what the police would make of it too." The color drained from Karen's face. "You wouldn't dare." "I would prefer not to," I said honestly. "I'm not looking for trouble, Karen. I just want to keep my chickens, which are completely legal according to county regulations, and collect the eggs that my family eats. That's all. She stared at me for a long moment, calculation evident in her eyes. Finally, she said, "Fine. Keep your stupid chickens. But if I get one single complaint about noise or smell, I'll make sure the board takes action." I nodded. "That's fair. And if I notice any more eggs missing, I might have to take action too. By the way, white vinegar and baking soda can help with persistent odors. Just a helpful neighbor tip." She turned on her heel and stalked off without another word. The immediate crisis was resolved, but I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to take defeat gracefully, and I suspected she would find other ways to make our lives difficult. I was right. Over the next few weeks, we received citations from the HOA for the most ridiculous infractions. Our grass was allegedly a quarter-inch too tall. The color of our mailbox, which came with the house, was not approved. The garden hose visible from the side of the house was unsightly. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine seemed larger than the last. "She's targeting us," my wife said as we looked over the latest notice. Apparently, the American flag we'd put up for Memorial Day was improperly displayed because it wasn't illuminated at night. "Yes, she is," I agreed, "but she's also getting careless. Most of these violations aren't even in the HOA covenants, at least not as specifically as she's citing them. I had been documenting everything, taking dated photos of our property to disprove her claims, and carefully reviewing the HOA documents to confirm what was and wasn't actually required. I was building a case, but I needed more than just our situation to make a compelling argument against Karen's reign of terror. So I started talking to our neighbors. Casually at first, comments about the weather that evolved into discussions about living in the neighborhood, which inevitably led to conversations about the HOA, and what I discovered was that we weren't alone. Karen had been bullying residents for years, selectively enforcing rules against people she didn't like while ignoring violations by her friends. One elderly neighbor told me she'd been fined because her roses grew an inch over the sidewalk. Another family had been denied permission to install a small ramp for their child's wheelchair because it would affect property values. A young couple had been forced to remove a memorial garden they'd planted after losing a baby. The more stories I heard, the more outraged I became. This wasn't just about my chickens anymore. It was about a petty tyrant abusing her power and making people's lives miserable. With the help of several neighbors, I began organizing. We started meeting discreetly, documenting patterns of selective enforcement, inconsistencies in HOA rulings, and possibly improper use of HOA funds. One neighbor who worked as an accountant volunteered to review the financial records, which Karen had been surprisingly reluctant to share with the community. As we dug deeper, we discovered that Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for landscaping services provided by her brother's company, at rates well above market value. She had also authorized emergency repairs to community property without board approval, all performed by contractors who happened to be her close friends. It was time to take action. The quarterly HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center. Usually these meetings were sparsely attended. Karen and her board cronies, plus maybe a handful of residents with specific issues to raise. But this time, nearly every homeowner in the development showed up. Karen looked visibly unsettled as people continued to file in, filling every seat and eventually standing along the walls. She called the meeting to order with a nervous tap of her gavel. "Before we begin with the regular agenda," she announced, "I'd like to propose a new amendment to our community guidelines regarding the keeping of livestock." And there it was. Despite our previous confrontation, she was still gunning for my chickens. The proposed amendment would prohibit the keeping of any livestock, including but not limited to chickens, ducks, goats, or other farm animals within the boundaries of our community, she continued. I stood up. "I'd like to address this proposal." Karen's lips thinned. "The floor is not open for discussion yet." "Actually," I said, "according to the HOA Bylaws Article 4, Section 3, any member may request to speak on a proposed amendment before it goes to vote. I'm invoking that right." There was a murmur through the crowd, and Karen looked momentarily flustered. She clearly hadn't expected me to know the rules so well. "Fine," she said curtly. "You have 2 minutes." I walked to the front of the room and turned to face my neighbors. Many of you know that my family keeps chickens in our backyard. What you may not know is that before we moved here, I researched all county ordinances and HOA regulations to ensure we were in compliance. Our property is zoned to allow for a small number of hens, no roosters, and there was no prohibition in the HOA covenants. I paused and looked directly at Karen. What you also may not know is that shortly after we moved in, the HOA president began trespassing on our property and stealing eggs from our chicken coop. The room erupted in surprised exclamations. Karen jumped to her feet. "That's a lie," she shouted. "You can't prove any such thing." I pulled out my phone. "Actually, I can. I installed a wildlife camera after noticing eggs repeatedly missing. I have time-stamped photos and video showing you entering our yard and taking eggs. I also have evidence of the subsequent harassment our family has faced through selective and often fabricated HOA violations." Karen's face had gone pale. This is ridiculous. I'm calling this meeting to order right now and—" "I'm not finished," I interrupted. "This isn't just about chickens or eggs, it's about abuse of power. And it's not just happening to us." I gestured to the elderly neighbor with the roses who stood up. Mrs. Martinez was fined 3 times for her roses growing over the sidewalk, a violation that doesn't exist in our covenants. Meanwhile, Board Member Johnson's boat has been parked in his driveway for over a year, despite a clear prohibition against that in our rules. The neighbor with the wheelchair ramp stood next. "My family was denied a necessary accommodation for our disabled child, which is not only against HOA regulations, but potentially violates the Americans with Disabilities Act." One by one, neighbors stood and shared their stories of Karen's tyrannical and inconsistent rule enforcement. The room grew increasingly tense. Finally, the accountant neighbor stood. "As a certified public accountant, I've reviewed the HOA financial statements for the past 3 years. I've identified several concerning patterns, including inflated payments to vendors with personal connections to the board president and undocumented emergency expenditures. I believe a full audit is warranted." Karen was sputtering now, gavel banging ineffectually. "This is outrageous. You can't just—" "Actually," said another neighbor, a lawyer, "according to our bylaws, Article 7, Section 5, members can call for a vote of no confidence in the board at any regular meeting if supported by at least 20% of homeowners present. I count well over that threshold here tonight." Karen looked around the room, suddenly realizing she was cornered. Her usual allies on the board were avoiding eye contact, clearly sensing which way the wind was blowing. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board president," the lawyer continued, "and I further move that we establish an independent committee to review all HOA finances and procedures for the past 5 years. "I second the motion," I said. "All in favor?" the lawyer called out. The response was overwhelming. Nearly every hand in the room went up. Karen looked shell-shocked. "You can't do this," she said weakly. "I've been president for 12 years. I've dedicated my life to this community." "The community has spoken," I replied, not unkindly. "Perhaps it's time for new leadership." The meeting continued with the election of an interim board president and the establishment of the review committee. Karen slipped out before it was over, head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone. In the months that followed, our neighborhood underwent a transformation. The review committee uncovered even more financial irregularities than we'd initially suspected, leading to Karen's resignation from the board entirely. The new board, led by the lawyer neighbor who had stood up at that fateful meeting, revised many of the more restrictive and arbitrary HOA rules. My chicken coop was officially approved, with reasonable guidelines established for anyone else who might want to keep backyard hens. The family with the disabled child got their ramp. Mrs. Martinez's roses were allowed to bloom in peace. As for Karen, she put her house on the market shortly after the audit results were presented. I heard she moved to a condo in the city, one without an HOA. My wife and I still laugh about the exploding rotten eggs that started it all. Was it petty? Perhaps. But it led to positive change for an entire community that had been suffering under a petty tyrant for far too long. And my chickens? They're still happily laying eggs, beautiful blue, green, and brown ones, which I now share with appreciative neighbors who often stop by to visit the hens that sparked a revolution. Sometimes I think about sending Karen a thank you note. After all, if she hadn't been so greedy for those pretty blue-green eggs, none of this would have happened. But instead, I just collect my eggs each morning, grateful for my little flock and the unexpected way they helped me connect with my community and create positive change. And I always make sure to check the dates on any eggs in the back of the refrigerator, just in case. The next one is a malicious compliances story. A few years ago, I worked armed security at a hospital. The Greater Health System owned 3 large hospitals, each with a 24-hour trauma center. It had a couple smaller county hospitals and dozens of clinics scattered across 3 states. I worked at one of the bigger hospitals in a bad part of town. There were legitimate security threats on a daily basis here. One day, I was told to stand at the main entrance and keep staff out. Me, huh? Apparently, some middle management person wrote a new policy that staff members are to enter and exit the building through the west entrance only. The main entrance was to be used by patients and guests, and they didn't want employees cluttering the main entrance, because God forbid people see medical staff upon entering a hospital. My task was to stand at the door and tell nurses, doctors, cafeteria staff, facilities, janitors, etc., to use the west entrance. Anyone who refused had their name written down and would be reprimanded later. Now, I had other shit to worry about, like EDP fighting people in the ER, or people running onto the helipad and taking a selfie with the life flight patient, or dudes on PCP yelling at the wheelchairs, or the old woman with dementia who wandered off and can't find her room. You know, actual security problems. The main entrance posting was a waste of my time, and it dragged on for several days, until one day, a man wearing a suit leading a gaggle of important people, all in business attire. The ringleader had an employee ID badge and was speaking enthusiastically to the group. They were heading straight for the main entrance. Me. Sorry folks, gotta use the west entrance, ringleader. What? Me. Hospital policy, all employees must use the west entrance. Ringleader. We're going to use this entrance, as he points to the door. Me. Okay, but I'll need to take your names down. Your supervisor will be informed. Ringleader stares at me like the biggest idiot alive and holds his ID badge in front of my face for an uncomfortably long time. I took his name down and every single member of his gaggle with painful slowness. I should add they were all very polite, despite my obvious lack of fucks to give. Shortly after the security supervisor arrives, supervisor. How's it going? Me. Not bad. I have a dozen or so names. And I show him the list, supervisor. Is that? He points to the ringleader's name. Me. I don't know. His badge said chief something officer. He looked important, supervisor. Chief executive officer? Me. Yeah, I think that was it. Supervisor quickly walks away. It turns out the CEO of the health system was bringing a group of potential investors, the aforementioned gaggle, for a tour of the place. He was never informed of the main entrance policy change and was greatly embarrassed to be stopped at the entrance of his own hospital by some rent-a-cop. Suddenly, as if by magic, staff could use the main entrance again, and I could return to actual security work. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.